welcome everyone to this recording of our presentation on the FIBA official basketball rules rule changes for 2020. The rule changes that we're going to talk about today were effective as of October 1st, 2020. And as we've all navigated a very difficult time in the world, we're realizing how special it is to be back involved on the floor and involved in high-level competition. Let's begin our presentation. Let's have a look at a number of abbreviations that are used in all FIBA material. These are abbreviations that we encourage everybody to be familiar with as we learn to speak the language of FIBA. In today's presentation, we will focus on three: UF for unsportsmanlike foul, AOS for active shooting, and IRS for the instant replay system. The abbreviations that you see are but a small portion of the terminology that is used in FIBA materials. This terminology can be found within an IoT, an individual officiating techniques manual that FIBA has posted within the FIBA IREF Academy Library app. We encourage you to be familiar with the abbreviations to help your understanding as we walk through our rule changes today. FIBA OBR Official Basketball Rules 2020, we've introduced four major rule changes. It is important to recognize that the first two we'll talk about are, at the end of the day, really just an adjustment in language, introducing language that is consistent with the contact philosophy that we've been teaching for a number of years now. Each of the major changes are designed to improve the image and the smooth running of the game, create a better game for the players, coaches, and spectators alike. We have four major rule changes, and we will talk about each in depth throughout the presentation, but let's introduce them to you now. Article 15, player in the act of shooting. We introduced different definitions for a shot, a stationary shot, and for a continuous movement. And we note it is continuous movement, not continuous motion. Our second major rule change occurs in Article 33, the cylinder, and our contact principles. The cylinder of the offensive player, with or without the ball, is defined, and the rule focuses on the legal and illegal actions by the offense and defense in respect to their and their opponent's cylinders. The definition of the defensive player's cylinder is unchanged. Article 37, unsportsmanlike foul. This is specifically our open path, our UF, unsportsmanlike foul, C4, criteria 4, where the rule is clarified, eliminating any reference to offensive and defensive players. The criteria is changed to focus on requiring that a player be progressing towards the opponent's basket with an open path, no other opponent player between the progressing player, the ball in the basket, and the illegal contact occurs laterally or from behind. Our fourth major change, Article 35, the double foul rule, where we find the definition of the double foul is simplified. Our focus is on requiring that the two fouls be of the same category. As noted, we will expand during the presentation on each of these four major changes. In addition to the four major changes, we introduce four minor changes. The first involving action on the court, the other three focusing on other aspects of the game. The first minor change in Article 5 are player injured or assisted, where we bring clarity that a player who receives an assistance is treated as if injured. and we will further expand and explain this. Appendix B is adjusted to provide clarity where the head coach is disqualified when they enter the floor and do not assist the referees while a fight may be in progress or the possibility of a fight, or when a fight occurs. We identify that if the coach is disqualified in this circumstances, they will be charged with a single disqualifying foul recorded as a D2 on the score sheet. Article 49 is amended to acknowledge the true duties of the scorer and the timer because of modern equipment. We shift some duties that in the language were responsibility of the scorer or the assistant scorer, and bring clarity that the responsibility for these table officials' duties now lie with the timer. We have a change in the instant replay system language, where in Appendix F, we provide clear direction developed at the latest FIBA top competitions on how the IRS is to be used. A protocol is now found in Appendix F that helps the referees ensure that we arrive at the correct decision. Let's begin by looking at the first of our minor changes, Article 5, a player who is injured or receives assistance, and the requirement for a substitution. We introduce language that provides that a player who receives an assistance must be substituted as if they were injured. We've known that an injured player who's not able to play immediately, and we define that as approximately 15 seconds, must be substituted. In the rule changes, we introduce that if any player receives an assistance from his own team members, they must also be substituted. It's important to recognize that this assistance could be for a number of reasons. It could be, as an example, a problem with a shoe, a contact lens, a loose taping, maybe a uniform issue. And it is important to recognize that when we talk about an assistance, this is an assistance from somebody who has left the bench, a head coach, an assistant coach, other team members, accompanying delegation members like a doctor or trainer, and comes onto the floor to provide that assistance. If that happens, the player must be substituted as if they were injured. In our first video, let's look at an example of a player who receives an assistance. In each of our plays, we will use this yellow circle to identify the key player. You'll see we have a stoppage in the play, and watch what happens when the referee goes to administer the throw-in. We see the referee turn and look. Something is happening behind him. We see a trainer has come onto the floor and is addressing a problem with the loose taping. When he is done, let's look at the curious look on the player's face. Something is happening behind him. A referee has called for a substitution. As this player has received an assistance, they must be replaced. This is a correct decision under the new rule. In addition, we find a consequential language amendment occurs within Article 44, correctable error, flowing from our change in the player injury and assistance rule. We note that if a player who is injured and leaves the game, if there's a correctable error, it will be their substitute that will participate in the correction of the error. We now add language that if the player leaves the floor because of an assistance and is unable to continue, that it is the substitute that must participate in the correction of the error. A very simple and logical change flowing out of our adjustment in the player injury and assistance rule. Let's look at the first of our major rule changes, Article 15, active shooting, or the AOS. The rule change is intended to improve players, coaches, and referees' understanding of whether a foul occurs in the act of shooting or not. We introduce concepts that are consistent with how the game is played, there being three types of active shooting: a shot, or a shot within continuous movement, and we break down the shot in a continuous movement to two parts: a drive to the basket or a moving shot. In every play, we should be able to identify if the act of shooting was in a shot, a drive to the basket, or a moving shot. What this does is it will require our referees to have basketball knowledge, focus our referee training on basketball knowledge to understand player shooting techniques, much more than just rule knowledge, but a greater understanding of the game itself. Let's break down these principles into further details as we move forward to our next slide. Let's focus on a player in the act of shooting with a shot. We define this as a stationary shot. So our example is the classic jump shot. So our player is not progressing, not moving, whether through running without the ball or dribbling. We're talking about a player stationary moving towards a shot. Whenever we talk about our active shooting rule, the two critical things for us to understand are when the shot begins and when the shot ends. Let's focus on when the shot begins. So on a stationary shot, the shot begins on the upward movement towards the shooting position and the basket. So the upward movement of the ball towards the opponent's basket. So not side to side movement, but the upward movement. And the instant the ball starts to move upward, as long as we continue towards the shooting position and the opponent's basket, we have begun the act of shooting. The end of the act of shooting occurs when the ball has left the player's hands, or if the shooter is airborne, when both feet have returned to the floor. A player who passes off after being fouled is no longer in the act of shooting. Let's move to some videos that will provide us examples of a player in the act of shooting a shot, a stationary shot. So let's have a look at a foul committed on a player in the act of shooting. Here's our key player. Let's come back and talk when we get to the replays. Can you identify when the act of shooting begins? Hopefully we were all able to recognize the point, but let's watch it on a replay. Our post player receives the ball, turns and faces the basket. We now have a potential of a stationary shot. And right here, we can see the upward motion starts and begins the act of shooting. The foul occurs after the act of shooting has begun. So clearly, on this play, we have a foul in the act of shooting recognized by the lead referee. 2 free throws. Let's now look at a foul committed on a player before the act of shooting has begun. Here's our key player, and once again, we will get an excellent look on the replays. Clearly, you saw that we have a foul, are we able to determine if this foul is before the act of shooting has begun. On that look, we can clearly see that the player fakes, the defender goes airborne, and commits a foul, all prior to the beginning of the upward motion. This foul is clearly committed prior to the act of shooting beginning. Let's move to a third video. In this case, a player fouled in the act of shooting. Let's compare this to the last video. Here we get an excellent look on the live play where we could see a fake, the defender goes airborne, and we actually see that the offensive player on their left side starts the upward motion prior to the illegal contact. Again, our best look is on the live video, but here in slow motion, we see the fake, and now we recognize that the player starts their upward motion, which begins the act of shooting. The foul occurs afterwards, and once again, we have a player who is fouled in the act of shooting. In this case, a good basket and 1 free throw shall be awarded. A good comparison to the earlier play. So the videos we've looked at have focused on a stationary shot. As we look at the second part of the new rule, we will focus on our new definition, continuous movement, and break it down into the 2 parts, a drive to the basket or a moving shot. In both situations, the player will catch the ball when progressing, simply running towards the basket, or when the player completes their dribble. If they gather the ball and continue to a shooting motion without stopping, the act of shooting will have begun as soon as the ball comes to rest in the hand or the hands of the player. We call this the gather. So once the ball comes to rest in the hand or the hands of the player, whether upon completion of a dribble or while progressing, as long as they continue to the shooting motion without stopping, the act of shooting has begun. The act of shooting, similarly to our stationary shot, ends when the ball has left the player's hands, and in the case of an airborne shooter, both feet have returned to the floor. And we once again note that if the player passes off after being fouled, they are no longer in the act of shooting. It's important to remember that a moving shot can change to a stationary shot if a player who's moving stops. Maybe the first motion is a fake and they bring themselves to a stop. If they reset, they now transfer to a stationary position, and we need to focus on the act of shooting beginning as we talked about for a stationary shot. Let's move to another series of 3 videos having a look at examples of moving shots. Let's begin with an example of a drive to the basket.
And
here's our key player. You will see that they are progressing, running without the ball. They receive a pass and immediately take the ball to the basket. So our keys are, we need to identify when the ball comes to rest in their hand. This will be the point that the act of shooting begins. Here, you can see that the player catches the ball, the act of shooting begins. They continue with the shooting motion to the basket, They're subsequently fouled, and therefore this player is fouled in the act of shooting. Good basket, 1 free throw. Let's have a look at an example of a drive to the basket and a pass off. Let's remember our keys. If the foul occurs after the act of shooting has begun, but the player decides to pass off, they are no longer in the act of shooting. Do we see the referee immediately recognizing the pass off? In that look, we get a good look at the pass off, but let's recognize our keys. Ball comes to rest in the player's hands. The act of shooting begins. The foul occurs almost simultaneously. However, after the act of shooting begins, the player passes off and they are no longer a player in the act of shooting. An excellent example of a pass off. Let's have a look at a moving shot, a foul committed on a player in the act of shooting. Our key player here along the baseline will receive a pass and begin moving towards the basket. They will then go into a moving shot. Our keys will be to determine, does the ball come to rest in their hands prior to being fouled? On that look, were you able to recognize that the ball had come to rest in their hands prior to the foul? On our replay, we see that the ball comes to rest here. They have begun the act of shooting. The foul occurs after the act of shooting begins. Therefore, this is a moving shot, player fouled in the act of shooting, resulting in 2 free throws. An excellent demonstration of our moving shot principles. On this slide, we will have a look at some points of emphasis. So some activity for referees to understand the act of shooting. It is important for our referees to know the basketball language and the different types of shots. We need to be able to identify in each play whether it has been a shot, a drive to the basket, or a moving shot. And we encourage referees to use self-talk and to provide verbal support after the call. We again emphasize that we note that a play can start as a moving shot and change for a shot if, for example, we have a fake and a new action begins. As we've noted, it is important for referees to have basketball knowledge, to understand players' shooting techniques, to understand how the game is played. Much more than rule knowledge, understanding the game from a player's and coach's perspective, having that basketball knowledge. Within Article 33, Contact Principles, we have seen an increase in the number of situations where defensive players invade or encroach upon the offensive player. These actions by defenders have generated additional responses that we do not want in basketball. Actions like elbows from the offense when trying to shed the defender that invades or encroaches their space. Perhaps actions by the defender to fake being fouled when the offense attempts a normal basketball move. It became apparent in a review of the rules that the rules only defined a defensive player's cylinder, and we needed rule language that could be used to fix this problem. Therefore, the rules were amended to add an offensive player's cylinder both with and without the ball. Let's break down the new rule into its various parts. So let's look at the definition of a cylinder for a player without the ball. And we note that there's two circumstances of players without the ball, defensive and offensive players. In this case, the boundaries of the cylinder remain unchanged from our earlier rule, other than our addition of the fact that the cylinder will exist for an offensive player without the ball. The front is defined by the palms of the hands in a normal stance, arms bent at the elbows. So thinking about it from a defensive perspective, this would be the classic defensive stance taught to all young players. The rear is defined by the buttocks in that normal athletic stance, and the sides by the outer edge of the arms and legs when in that athletic stance with bent knees and arms bent at the elbows. Our focus will always be on the normal basketball stance, not an exaggerated stance, but that balanced defensive position that we all know and can recognize. Let's move forward and look at the definition of the cylinder for an offensive player with the ball. Mentally, for years, all of our participants in the game of basketball have understood that there was a limit on the position, the stance that an offensive player could take, but we never defined it in the rules. We now have a definition of an offensive player's cylinder. The feet, the front, is defined by the feet, bent knees, and arms with the ball held above the hips, in the position commonly referred to as triple threat, the position from which a player may shoot, pass, or dribble drive. Again, the rear is defined by the buttocks in that normal athletic stance in our triple threat position, and the sides by the outer edge of the arms and the legs in that athletic stance with bent knees, arms bent at the elbows, our triple threat position. So now that we've introduced the two types of cylinders, let's move forward and look at how our officiating principles, our rule principles, are impacted by this addition. This slide is a particularly critical slide within our presentation. You'll note that we refer to the rights and duties of the offensive and defensive players. We might have called this privileges and responsibilities. And for all participants in the game, these are important concepts to understand. We introduce language that says the offensive player with the ball must be allowed enough space for a normal basketball play within their cylinder. And we define what those normal basketball plays are. On the lower left portion of the slide, you can see we refer to dribbling, passing, shooting, and pivoting. Four very normal basketball plays. In terms of defining our cylinders and determining which player has encroached, which player has invaded into the opponent's cylinder, we will look for whether the forearms are vertical or horizontal, the forearms of the offensive player. On our slide, you'll note that we have used a green thumbs up for good and a red thumbs up as a warning, as a flag. So when the ball is moved side to side, we will look, is it moved side to side high or low, or is it moved at the chest level? And again, we identify the high and the low side to side with the green thumbs up, and at the chest level with the red thumbs down, indicating a flag or a warning. As a general principle, when shifting the ball side to side, if the forearms are more vertical than horizontal and illegal contact occurs, the defense is at greater risk for having encroached, invaded into the offensive player's cylinder. However, when the ball is shifted side to side, if the forearms are more horizontal than vertical, particularly with the ball at chest level, the offense is at greater risk. As we move forward, we'll expand on these principles and break them down further. These are general principles and guidelines, concepts that may take some time for all of us to recognize in the game, but we note that these concepts are entirely consistent with the philosophy that has been taught for many years. So while this is a change, it truly is a clarification, bringing further clarification, further information to our contact principles to ensure that we have a balanced game between offense and defense. So our principles are relatively simple. The defense may not enter the cylinder of the offensive player with the ball and illegally contact the offensive player when the offense is attempting a normal basketball play. We say that the defense may not belly up or use the lower part of the body or arms to encroach into the offensive player's cylinder and cause an illegal contact. The defense may not invade the vertical cylinder of the offensive player and make illegal contact when the offense is attempting a normal basketball play. We place restrictions on the offense that the offense may not spread their legs or arms outside the cylinder and cause illegal contact with an opponent in an attempt to gain additional space to clear out the defense. In our principles, we ask the question, which player encroaches or invades the opponent's cylinder? And it will be important that we are able to identify the first illegal action and call the personal foul, particularly if that illegal action involves the defense leaving their cylinder, invading the offensive cylinder, and creating illegal contact. If we have a look at the pictures at the bottom of the slide, on the left, we identify an illegal action by the defense. Our red line identifies the limit to the cylinder, and you can see that the defense has actually come out of their legal cylinder, has invaded, bellied up into the offensive player's cylinder. They've come right over their leg. That offensive player has a right to be vertical over their right hip. And on the left hand or on the right hand side of the slide, you can see the offensive player has done exactly that. They have stood up vertical within their cylinder, a legal action by the offense. And in this case, the defense is responsible for the contact, for that invasion, for that encroachment into the cylinder. Let's have a look at a video that demonstrates this principle for us further. Let's look at an example of illegal defense. A defensive player who leaves their cylinder and makes illegal contact by invading, encroaching into the offensive player's cylinder. Watch the live play, and we'll come back and talk during the replay. Were you able to see blue number 70 invade, encroach upon the white player's cylinder? We'll get a blown up example and have a very good look coming up here. Watch this blue player come right over the leg of the white player, come outside their cylinder, and create illegal contact on white number 17. This is a foul. We need to recognize it immediately. Call the illegal contact, and we do not end up with a shot clock violation. So we've had an opportunity to have a look at a video where we saw that defensive player invading the offensive player's cylinder. We repeat our principles that the defensive player may not enter the cylinder of the offensive player with the ball and illegally contact the offensive player when the offense is attempting a normal basketball play. And similarly, the offense may not spread their legs or arms outside their cylinder and cause an illegal contact with the opponent to gain additional space, to clear out the defense. Our focus becomes which player encroaches or invades the opponent's cylinder. The small pictures on this slide are the video that we're going to have a look at. And it's a video that we want to watch from multiple angles to understand the play. But let's look at our pictures. On the left-hand side, we identify legal defense. In this case, by the green vertical line, you can see that the defensive player has not come out of their cylinder. They have remained in their legal cylinder. And you can see what we talked about earlier, that normal athletic stance, bent arms and bent knees in a perfectly legal position. On the right-hand side, you will identify that the contact is to the chin level with the side of the forearm. What has happened here is that the offensive player has gone out of their cylinder and has created the contact. As we move to the video, we will note there are a number of things we must further consider. We talked earlier about vertical forearms and indicating that generally when moving the ball side to side, this would indicate that the defense was at greater risk. However, when you watch the video, recognize where the ball starts. And on this picture on the right-hand side and the picture on the far right of the slide, you can recognize that this movement by the offensive player starts at the chest level and the sweeping motion occurs from there. So we will clearly see that the offense has gone outside their cylinder and initiated the contact on a legal defender. After the video, we'll come back and talk further about it, but let's have a look at it, being very careful to watch it through to each of the replays. Let's have a look at illegal contact by an offensive player. It's important to watch this play through to the replays. We will get an opportunity to see that the offensive player comes out of their cylinder and makes illegal contact. Critically, we will identify and see here that the defense remains in their cylinder at all times. This illegal contact is caused by the offensive player leaving their cylinder. Let's get another look at these two angles. Here's our defensive player, approaches but remains completely in a legal position in their cylinder. We watch the offender make a normal basketball play but come out of their cylinder and make illegal contact with the side of the forearm on the defensive player. From this angle, we once again see that the defense remains legal, does not leave their cylinder, and it is the offense that extends outside their cylinder and makes illegal contact, a personal foul on the offensive player. So let's have a look at two additional slides on this concept. Now that we've seen a video that has shown a defensive player coming in and invading the offensive player's cylinder, and an example of the offense leaving their cylinder and initiating contact with the defender. If the offensive player makes a normal basketball move inside their legal cylinder and illegal contact occurs, generally this will be a defensive foul and we must call this first illegal contact. By addressing the first illegal contact, we will prevent a reaction. However, we must still be prepared to identify unsportsmanlike actions that may follow, all in accordance with the rules. However, when the offensive player makes that normal basketball move, but goes outside his cylinder and illegal contact occurs, this will generally be an offensive personal foul. Once again, our focus is on calling the first illegal contact, and that will prevent a reaction. But all participants in the game must be prepared to identify unsportsmanlike actions that may follow, all in accordance with the rules. Let's move to a slide that further explains this principle between a personal foul and an unsportsmanlike foul. So this is a very helpful slide to help us understand the difference between a basketball action and an unsportsmanlike action. Earlier in the presentation, we talked about vertical forearms versus horizontal forearms. Our top half of the slide here further expands on this principle of vertical forearms. And when the contact occurs with vertical forearms and the offensive player has gone outside their cylinder, we are not seeing a contact with an elbow. Rather, we're seeing contact with the side of the forearm. And this contact will not involve excessive force. As you think about these principles, I would encourage you to try this. Hold your forearms vertical with an imaginary ball, and now pivot, swing side to side. You will find that that is a normal basketball action, and if contact were to occur, it will occur with the side of the forearm, not the action, not the elbow, and will generally not be with an excessive force. However, with your imaginary ball, hold it at chest level with your forearms horizontal. And now, when we swing side to side, we will note that this contact is with the elbow, is not part of a normal basketball action, and may involve excessive force. This is an excellent example of why we encourage and teach our referees basketball knowledge to understand the difference between a basketball play and a non-basketball play, and help to understand if the contact may involve excessive force, which will raise it from the level of a personal foul to an unsportsmanlike foul. In the video we witnessed, we saw an example of a personal foul because we saw that that action was part of a normal basketball play, the player attempting to move the ball side to side. However, they had come out of their cylinder and caused contact with the side of the forearm. Let's shift our focus and look at our third major rule change. Article 35, the double foul. This change simplifies the rule, and we move away from complexities that were introduced in 2018. We generally return the rule to previous concepts. We introduce language that for a double foul to occur, we need 4 conditions to exist. The first criteria, both fouls are player fouls, so involving the 10 players on the floor. Both fouls involve physical contact. That tells us immediately that a technical foul is never part of the double foul rule. Certainly, we may have offsetting penalties involving technical fouls, but we do not have a double foul. The fouls will always involve physical contact. Both fouls are the same 2 opponents fouling each other, and both fouls are the same category. and we define the categories as personal, or our second category is unsportsmanlike or disqualifying. So unsportsmanlike or disqualifying fouls are one category, and personal fouls are the other category. There's no longer any concern whether one of the fouls is a team control foul or if either team is in the penalty. We merely look for the four criteria. Both fouls are player fouls. Both fouls involve physical contact. Both fouls involve the same two opponents, and they're of the same category, personal or unsportsmanlike or disqualifying. This rule change simplifies the understanding of the game for players, coaches, spectators, and referees alike. Let's look at an example of a double foul where both fouls are personal fouls. Here, we identify the two key players, but the action occurs at the other end of the floor. Are you able to identify all four criteria? Player fouls involving physical contact, the same two opponents fouling each other, and both fouls being of the same category. In this case, personal fouls. As we watch the replay, note the referee recognizing the double foul, but note where the ball is when this occurs. On this replay, we will see the red team gain control of the ball. This will start the shot clock. This is followed by the two players committing fouls against each other, a double foul recognized by the referee. The result is a throw-in for the red team with 23 seconds left on the shot clock. An example of a double foul. Article 37, the unsportsmanlike foul rule, introduces a change to one criteria, our criteria 4, so UFC4. We're dealing specifically with the foul that we call the clear path foul. And once again, this change is intended to improve the image of the game, make it easier to understand the rules for players, coaches, and spectators. The rule change simplifies the game, and we no longer need to concern ourselves as to which team has control of the ball or if team control has changed. We need three criteria to be present to have a UFC4 or the open path foul called. Firstly, that there's no other opponent player between the progressing player, the ball, and the opponent's basket. That the player is progressing towards the opponent's basket, and the illegal contact occurs on the progressing player from behind or laterally. It's important to recognize that when the rule was written, the language used was no other player between the progressing player, the ball, and the opponent's basket. Within the OBRI, the Official Basketball Rules Interpretations 2020, we've added language to clarify that the reference should be read as no other opponent player between the progressing player, the ball, and the opponent's basket. And while we do speak about these three criteria having to be present, it is important to remember that once the player is in the act of shooting, the automatic unsportsmanlike foul, C4, is no longer a factor. Certainly, a player in the act of shooting may be fouled in an unsportsmanlike manner. We may have a not legitimate attempt to play the ball, or we may have a foul involving hard or excessive contact, so our C1 and C2 criteria, but the automatic UF C4 ends as soon as the player's in the act of shooting. Let's move forward and look at the rationale for this particular change. We found there were too many plays where the referee would get caught up trying to determine if team control had changed or if the foul was committed before team control had changed. If the foul was committed while the offense was still in control, we saw examples where the result was the offense gained an advantage not intended by the rule. Many participants, players, coaches, spectators, and even some referees struggle with these concepts, struggle with recognizing team control or the change in status of team control. So our new language removes the requirement to identify offensive and defensive players. It's no longer relevant whether the player has control of the ball. We merely look for our criteria. We look to see that we have a progressing player with an open path to the opponent's basket with no other opponent between the progressing player and the ball in the basket, and the contact occurs laterally or behind. Our example video that we will move to now provides an excellent demonstration of these new concepts where we will simply look for those three criteria: progressing player with no other opponent between the ball and the basket, and illegal contact, even if a normal basketball play, that occurs laterally or from behind. Let's move to our video. Let's look at an example of an unsportsmanlike foul, criteria 4, an open path foul. We will see a number of replays, and we will talk throughout those replays. Let's find the necessary criteria of the open path foul. Do we have a player progressing towards the basket with no other opponent player between themselves, the ball and the basket? And do we have illegal contact laterally or from behind? In this case, we see that all of the criteria exist. We have an unsportsmanlike foul, our clear path foul, a UF C4. Under the new rule, this is a correct decision, an automatic unsportsmanlike foul, criteria 4. Let's take just a minute to look at a slide that explains one of our minor rule changes, Article 49, timer's duties. We're not going to spend time in the presentation reviewing this. This is activity that involves the table officials and occurs off the court. We're going to encourage participants to do a little self-study and to understand these changes, recognizing that they're consistent with how the table officials have operated for a number of years, merely transferring duties from the scorer and the assistant scorer in rulebook language to the timer. In a similar way, we have a change to Appendix B, the score sheet. Again, we have a small change in Appendix B, the score sheet, where we have clarified to make it easier to understand how when a coach is disqualified because of active involvement in a fighting situation or coming onto the floor and not assisting the referees, that coach will be disqualified and charged with a single disqualifying foul recorded as a D2. This slide and the slide that follows further expands these principles so that we can all understand how this situation will be penalized if it involves other individuals like the first assistant coach or others that come onto the floor and either do not assist the referees or actively participate in the fight. Let's look at a similar slide that further expands these principles. So once again, we will encourage all of our participants to have a look at this slide. This expands the principles that we've talked about, adding circumstances where substitutes or excluded players come onto the floor, and We still have that single foul charged to the head coach. However, if they participate, each of those individuals results in a disqualifying foul that is penalized with 2 free throws and possession. A complex concept, certainly a circumstance that we don't want to see in the games, but we need rules to cover it. And you can look at within the rule book, get a better feel, come back to these slides, and they will clearly explain for you how these circumstances will be penalized in the game. Let's have a look at Appendix F, the instant replay system. And we note, with over 90% of global basketball played not using the IRS, not using the instant replay system, it made sense to create a separate appendix for the IRS and the IRS review. In this way, the IRS rules do not distract from the rules most games are played under. In addition, it makes it easier to find everything related to the IRS in a single place. And the strength of the change, it allows all to do the work to study a new protocol for referees to follow on all IRS reviews. Adding the protocol to the rules demonstrates how important it is to follow proper procedures, and following these procedures has had a positive impact on ensuring the correct outcome. Let's look at our protocol. As noted, we've introduced a protocol for referees to follow on all IRS situations. We've developed a clear, cogent, and concise protocol for use in all IRS situations. The rule and the protocol are found in Appendix F, and all referees who officiate involving games using the IRS should learn the protocol as well as the rule. The use of the correct communication protocols lead to quality decisions. Our protocol includes a number of criteria. And let's have a look at those criteria. First, an initial decision must be made and communicated. That is reported through the table. So the initial decision on the floor shall be clear to both benches, to both coaches before going to the IRS. The crew chief and a minimum of one umpire, the umpire who made the call shall review the play. If the crew chief made the call, he shall choose one of the umpires to participate in viewing the video. We note that while time is of the essence, the goal is to get the play right. And if it's necessary to get the play right, the other umpire, the umpire who was initially looking after the teams during the review, can join the review with the first umpire then being responsible for the teams. In this way, all three referees review the play, and this should be done when necessary to get the play right, when the crew chief determines a third opinion is required. During the review, the crew chief must ensure no unauthorized persons have access to the IRS monitor. We note that the review takes place before timeouts or substitutions are administered. The referee that made the call shall report the call to the table, the final decision, when the referees come back from the review. And finally, we note that either team has the right to cancel a substitution or timeout request after the IRS review. We do note that the initial decision of the referees can be corrected only if the IRS review provides the referees with clear and conclusive visual evidence for a correction. Let's look at an example from the World Cup of a use of the IRS, the instant replay system, and our new protocol. Let's look at a video that demonstrates our protocol for the instant replay system. Here's our calling official. Let's watch them through to the reporting sequence. We will see that the calling official shows the initial decision to the table and then indicates, using the signal, that the referees are going to go to the IRS, the instant replay system, to review the play. Our crew chief and the official that made the call go to the monitor to look at the play. They ensure that no other persons, unauthorized persons, have access to the video. They review the play with the help of the replay official. They identify that we have a UF C1, a not legitimate attempt to play the ball. They also identify the correct shooter and how the ball will return to play. When they are finished, they've made their decision, they come back, and the official that made the call will report the final decision in front of the table, an unsportsmanlike foul, UF C1. That concludes our presentation today. And in summary, we've had an opportunity to look at the FIBA 2020 official basketball rules rule changes that were effective as of October 1st, 2020. In addition, FIBA has published the AUBRI, the official basketball rules interpretations, published in late September, that provides clarity, provides place situations for all of these changes. Today, we've spoken about 4 major changes and 4 minor changes. We note with our major changes, the first 2 are adjustments in language to be consistent with the contact philosophy that has been taught for the last number of years. Each of the major changes are designed to make the game more dynamic. They improve the image and smooth running of the game. The first, Article 15, player in the act of shooting. We introduce different definitions for a shot and for a continuous movement, noting it's movement and not motion. And within continuous movement, we have a drive to the basket and a moving shot. Within Article 33, our cylinder principle, we introduce a cylinder for an offensive player with or without the ball. This helps us to understand which player is responsible for illegal contact, and we use our language of the identifying which opponent invades or encroaches upon the opponent's cylinder. And we note that the definition of the defensive player's cylinder remains unchanged. Our third major change, Article 37, the unsportsmanlike foul, our open path rule, our UFC4. The rule is clarified, eliminating any reference to offensive and defensive players. Our criteria is changed to require a progressing player with an open path to the basket, no other opponent player between the ball and the basket, and the illegal contact being laterally or behind. Our fourth major change, our double foul. The definition of the double foul is simplified, focusing on requiring that the 2 fouls be of the same category. So player fouls involving contact, the same 2 opponents, and of the same category, either a personal foul or an unsportsmanlike or disqualifying foul. And our 4 minor changes, the one that impacts the game the most is Article 5, bringing clarity that a player who receives an assistance is treated as if they're injured. Our focus is on understanding that the assistance is provided by somebody who has left the bench and come onto the floor to provide that assistance. Our last 3 Minor changes are all things that we encourage our participants to study and understand further. Certainly within Appendix B, we bring the clarity where the head coach is disqualified when a fight occurs. We have a single foul charged if they're responsible as a D2, or if it's perhaps the first assistant coach that goes onto the floor and is involved, that the first assistant coach is disqualified, but the head coach is charged with a B2 foul. In Article 49, we adjust language that identifies the true duties of the scorers and the timer, moving certain duties to the timer. And as we wrapped up with our IRS protocol, we create Appendix F that provides clear direction developed at the latest FIBA top competitions on how the IRS is to be used, and we contain all of the rule in a single location. I want to thank everybody for their participation today. We hope that we've been able to provide you with some guidance on the FIBA official basketball rules, rule changes for 2020. We wish everyone the best. Thank you.